The 1980s had a sound all their own on Australian roads. Six-cylinder Falcons rolled past Holden Commodores, little lasers squeezed into suburban car parks, and every now and then, a rotary Mazda or turbocharged Toyota would turn heads. These weren't just cars sitting in driveways. They were the cars Australians drove to work, took on holidays, and kept for years. 10 of them became especially memorable, each for a very different reason. And at number 1 is the car that arrived near the end of the decade and immediately changed the balance of Australian motoring. Number 10. Holden Gemini. The Holden Gemini was already an established name when the 1980s began, but it remained one of Australia's best-known small cars during the early part of the decade. The Gemini was built locally at Holden's Acacia Ridge plant in Queensland, and its compact size, 4-cylinder engine and rear-wheel drive layout gave it a very different character from the big Australian sedans. That combination was important. The Falcon and Commodore were still the cars many Australian families wanted, but the Gemini offered something those cars couldn't match. It was smaller, lighter, and more economical. Holden's own heritage history describes the Gemini as Australia's most popular 4-cylinder car, showing just how important it became in a market that had traditionally favored larger engines. For younger drivers, the Gemini also became an important first car. It was simple enough to understand, cheap enough to maintain, and small enough to make city driving less intimidating. The Gemini didn't have the glamour of a V8 Commodore, but it earned something arguably more valuable. It became familiar, and once a car becomes part of everyday Australian life, it becomes very difficult to forget. But the next car showed just how quickly Australian buyers were becoming comfortable with Japanese engineering. Number 9. Mitsubishi Sigma. The Mitsubishi Sigma became one of the most important Japanese-influenced family cars built in Australia during the early 1980s. Mitsubishi took over Chrysler Australia's South Australian operations in 1980, including the Tonsley Park manufacturing facilities. The Sigma was already an established model, but Mitsubishi's arrival gave the car a new future in Australia. The Sigma appealed to people who wanted family car space without necessarily wanting a traditional large 6-cylinder sedan. Its 4-cylinder engines were economical, while the roomy cabin and comfortable ride made it perfectly suited to everyday Australian driving. There was nothing particularly flashy about the Sigma. That was part of its appeal. It simply did the job. For many owners, a Sigma meant commuting during the week, shopping on Saturday, and loading the family into the car for a long trip on Sunday. It also helped establish Mitsubishi as a serious Australian manufacturer, and that mattered because the local market was changing quickly. Japanese brands were no longer simply selling small imports. They were building cars in Australia and competing directly with Holden and Ford. But the next car brought a completely different kind of excitement. Number 8. Mazda RX-7. The second-generation Mazda RX-7 arrived in 1985 and immediately stood apart from almost everything else on Australian roads. Instead of a conventional piston engine, it used Mazda's 13B rotary engine. Mazda's Australian heritage material records the second-generation RX-7 as launching in 1985, with the naturally aspirated version producing 146 horsepower and 182 Newton-meters of torque. The RX-7 was also remarkably light for a sports car of its period. Its appeal wasn't about carrying the family or towing a caravan. It was about driving. The low seating position, compact rotary engine, and sports car proportions gave it a character that the big Australian sedans simply couldn't reproduce. And Mazda wasn't building its reputation only on the road. The RX-7 had already established itself in Australian motorsport, adding credibility to the car's performance image. For Australian enthusiasts, seeing an RX-7 on the road was an event. It looked exotic without carrying the price or badge of a European sports car. It also gave young enthusiasts something different to aspire to. Not a V8, not a big six, a rotary. And that made the RX-7 one of the decade's most memorable cars. But the next vehicle was much larger and represented the final chapter of an older Australian tradition. Number 7. Holden Statesman WB. The Holden Statesman WB arrived in 1980 as the final generation of Holden's original large Australian luxury cars. It was based on the long wheelbase architecture used for Holden's larger models and offered the sort of space and presence that was becoming increasingly difficult to find. The WB Statesman was introduced in May 1980. Production continued into the early 1980s, with the Series 2 version arriving later, before production finally ended in 1985. It was a very different proposition from the Gemini. The Statesman was about space. The rear seat was important. The long body gave the car a formal appearance, and large engines provided the effortless performance expected from a luxury Holden. But its real significance today is historical. The WB was effectively the end of Holden's old generation of uniquely Australian large luxury cars. After it came a different era, with Holden increasingly looking overseas for the foundations of its future models. So when you see a well-preserved WB Statesman today, you're not simply looking at an old luxury sedan. You're looking at the closing chapter of an Australian design tradition. And from here, the countdown moves into the cars that defined the middle of the decade. Number 6. Ford Falcon XE. The Ford Falcon XE arrived in 1982 and immediately changed the Australian sales battle. Ford introduced the XE after a period in which the company had been working hard to improve the Falcon's fuel economy, handling and overall efficiency. The result was a Falcon that still looked unmistakably Australian, but had been substantially refined. The important number came from the sales charts. In June 1982, the Falcon and Fairmont range recorded 7,097 registrations, compared with 6,045 for the Commodore range. Ford then held the #1 position for the next 7 years. That makes the XE much more than another Falcon. It was the car that helped Ford take control of the Australian market. The XE also became strongly associated with Australian touring car racing, adding a performance identity to an already successful family sedan. For ordinary owners, however, the attraction was simpler. There was plenty of room inside, there was a choice of engines, and it was built for the long distances Australians routinely travelled. A Falcon could be the family car on Monday, and the caravan tow vehicle on Friday afternoon. That versatility was one of the reasons the nameplate became so deeply embedded in Australian culture. But Ford wasn't the only manufacturer producing a major Australian success. The next car came from Holden, and it took the Commodore into a more sophisticated era. Number 5. Holden Commodore VL. The Holden VL Commodore arrived in 1986 and represented a major change for the Commodore. Holden's own heritage material describes the 1980s as a period of technological development for the company, with the VL marking the peak of the first-generation Commodore before the much larger VN arrived. The most talked about change was under the bonnet. The VL used Nissan's RB30 straight-six, while the V8 remained available. That Nissan engine decision was controversial among traditional Holden fans, but it also gave the Commodore a modern fuel-injected 6-cylinder engine. The shape was another major attraction. The VL looked smoother and more contemporary than the earlier Commodores, and the Calais added features that gave the car a distinctly 80s feel. Then came the turbocharged versions. The VL Turbo turned the Commodore into a genuine performance machine and became one of the most desirable Australian cars of the decade. But even the ordinary 6-cylinder VL mattered. It was comfortable, quick enough for Australian highways, and practical enough to serve as the family car. It was a Holden that could satisfy very different buyers. And by the end of the decade, Holden was preparing something much bigger. Number 4. Ford Laser. The Ford Laser became one of the defining small cars of 80s Australia. It was based on the Mazda 323 and was built at Ford's Homebush plant in Sydney. The Laser gave Ford a strong presence in the rapidly expanding small car market. Its formula was simple: 4-cylinder power, front-wheel drive, compact dimensions, low running costs. That made it particularly attractive to younger drivers, couples and families looking for a second car. The Laser also represented a broader change in Australian motoring. The big Falcon and Commodore were still enormously important, but Australians were no longer automatically choosing the largest car they could afford. The Laser was proof. It could fit into smaller parking spaces, use less fuel, and handle everyday commuting without drama. And Ford had something else going for it. The Laser was backed by Mazda engineering, giving buyers a combination of familiar Ford branding and Japanese mechanical design. It became one of the major small car success stories of the decade, but the next car took Australians in an entirely different direction. Number 3. Toyota Supra. Toyota's Supra became one of the most recognizable Japanese performance cars of the 1980s. Toyota Australia's own history records the second-generation Supra arriving on 2nd July 1981. The GA61 GT used a 6-cylinder engine producing 92 kilowatts, and featured independent rear suspension, power windows, and power locks. Then, in February 1986, the Supra became considerably more serious. Toyota released the 3-liter GT Turbo with a 24-valve turbocharged and fuel-injected 6-cylinder engine, producing 169 kilowatts and 323.6 Newton-meters. Those figures made the Supra a serious performance car for its time, but numbers alone don't explain its reputation. The Supra looked different. It sat low, it had the long bonnet and compact cabin, associated with a proper sports coupe, and unlike many performance cars, it could still be used on a normal Australian road without feeling completely impractical. For enthusiasts growing up in the 1980s, the Supra represented something exciting coming from Japan. It wasn't a Falcon, it wasn't a Commodore, it was its own thing, and that made it memorable. Only 2 cars remain, and the next one became one of the most important 4-wheel drives Australia had seen. Number 2. Holden Jackaroo. The Holden Jackaroo arrived in 1981 and became Holden's first 4-wheel drive vehicle. Holden's heritage material specifically records that milestone. The early Jackaroo was built by Isuzu and sold in Australia with Holden badging. Its purpose was clear. It was designed to go beyond the sealed road. The first generation offered petrol and diesel engines, with the early petrol model using a 2-liter 4-cylinder engine. For Australians living outside the major cities, that capability mattered. Farmers, campers, country families, and people who regularly traveled on rough roads had a vehicle that could handle terrain where an ordinary sedan simply couldn't. And remember, this was before the modern SUV became a normal suburban family vehicle. A 4-wheel drive still had a sense of purpose. The Jackaroo looked like it was built to work. It also helped establish a category that would become enormously important in Australia over the following decades. But there is one car left. And this final entry didn't just become another iconic Australian model. It changed the direction of the entire Holden range. Number 1. Holden Commodore VN. The number 1 spot belongs to the Holden Commodore VN. Holden introduced the VN in 1988 as a much larger Commodore, addressing one of the biggest criticisms of the original design. Holden's heritage records the VN as the next major step in the Commodore story, and the model went on to win the 1988 Wheels Car of the Year award. The difference was immediately obvious. The VN was larger, it had more interior room, and Holden had returned to a distinctly Australian scale, while retaining the more modern styling that had made the Commodore successful. The engine range included the new 3.8-liter Buick-derived V6 and Holden's 5-liter V8, but the real achievement came in the sales results. RAC says Australians responded strongly to the larger VN, with the Commodore becoming number 1 the following year. That means the VN arrived in 1988 and became Australia's best-selling passenger car in 1989. It was more than a successful new model. It represented Holden's answer to the Falcon. And for a generation of Australian drivers, it became the defining family sedan of the late 80s. The VN also showed that Holden could take a European-inspired Commodore concept, enlarge it for Australian expectations, and create something that once again dominated the local market. That is why it takes the number 1 position. Not because it was the fastest, not because it was the most luxurious, because it arrived at exactly the right moment and changed the direction of Australian motoring. The 1980s gave Australia some extraordinary cars. There were small cars like the Gemini and Laser, family favorites like the Sigma and Falcon, performance icons like the RX-7 and Supra, and tough 4-wheel drives like the Jackaroo. But the VN Commodore brought many of those ideas together. It was modern enough to feel new, large enough to satisfy traditional Australian buyers, and successful enough to put Holden back at the top. Which car from the 1980s do you remember most clearly? Was it the VN Commodore, the XE Falcon, the VL, or something completely different? Let me know in the comments. I read every comment, and if these cars brought back a few memories, like the video, subscribe to Sunburnt Chrome, and I'll see you in the next one.